December 4, 1918, Brooklyn, New York. In a modest apartment on Garfield Place, May Capone held her newborn son against her chest. The boy's name was Albert Francis Capone, though everyone would come to call him Sonny. Outside, the streets bustled with the ordinary chaos of working-class Brooklyn. Pushcart vendors hawked their goods. Immigrant families crowded tenement stoops. The elevated trains rattled overhead, shaking windows and drowning conversation. Inside, May looked down at her infant son with a mother's hope, unaware that the child sleeping in her arms would spend his entire life running from a name he never chose. His father, at that moment, was nobody. Just another young Italian immigrant trying to make his way in America. Al Capone worked as a bookkeeper, a legitimate job with legitimate pay. He had learned the trade from his employer, a respectable businessman who saw potential in the young man's quick mind and facility with numbers. But within 6 years, everything would change. The boy born into anonymity would become the son of the most infamous criminal in American history. The Capone family in those early years lived modestly. Al's income as a bookkeeper provided enough for rent, food, basic necessities. May kept house, cared for their son, and maintained the illusion that they were like any other young family in Brooklyn. Sonny's first years were unremarkable. He learned to walk, to talk, to play in the streets under his mother's watchful eye. There was nothing to suggest the trajectory his life would take. The infection came when Sonny was still young, perhaps 7 or 8 years old. A mastoid infection. Bacterial, aggressive, spreading through the bones behind his left ear. In the 1920s, such infections killed children regularly. Before the discovery of antibiotics, these infections were death sentences as often as not. Even with treatment, survival was never guaranteed. The pain was excruciating, the fever relentless. Sonny cried through the nights while May applied cool compresses to his burning forehead and prayed to saints she had learned about as a girl in Ireland. The doctors explained the options to May and Al with the blunt honesty of the era. Surgery, dangerous and invasive, cutting into the mastoid bone near the brain, or death. There was no third option. No miracle drug that could save him. Only the knife and the surgeon's skill stood between Sonny and the grave. They chose the knife. The surgery took place in a New York hospital. Surgeons drilled into the boy's skull, accessing the infected bone, removing diseased tissue with the crude tools available in that age before antibiotics. There was no MRI to guide them, no CT scan to reveal the infection's precise location. They worked from experience, from anatomical knowledge, from educated guesses. One wrong move could sever critical vessels, damage the brain, leave the boy paralyzed or worse. Sonny survived. But the infection and the surgery left permanent damage. He lost most of the hearing in his left ear. For the rest of his life, he would turn his head slightly when people spoke to him, angling his right ear toward their voices. The hearing loss was permanent, irreversible. It would affect his education, his social interactions, his ability to serve in the military when war came. The mastoid infection took something from him that could never be replaced. While Sonny recovered, his father ascended. By the mid-1920s, Al Capone controlled Chicago. Bootlegging, gambling, prostitution, an empire built on prohibition's hypocrisy. The 18th Amendment had banned alcohol, and in doing so, had created the most lucrative black market in American history. Al Capone recognized the opportunity and seized it with both hands. He supplied speakeasies across Chicago. He bribed police officers, judges, politicians. He eliminated competitors with bullets and bombs. The newspapers called him Scarface. Federal agents called him untouchable. And young Sonny Capone attended school with a last name that made teachers nervous and other children cruel. Imagine being 10 years old and having your classmates whisper about your father. Imagine the other children asking if it's true that your dad kills people. Imagine teachers looking at you with a mixture of fear and pity, wondering what to do with the son of a monster. Sonny lived this reality every day. The playground taunts, the pointed questions, the isolation that comes when other parents tell their children to stay away from that Capone boy. In 1931, everything collapsed. Federal prosecutors, unable to prove murder or racketeering, convicted Al Capone on tax evasion charges. The sentence, 11 years. The boy was 13 years old when his father went to prison, first to the Atlanta Penitentiary, then to the newly opened Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary on an island in San Francisco Bay. The trial had been a media circus. Reporters filled the courtroom, documenting every moment, every witness, every piece of evidence. The conviction made headlines across the country. Public enemy number one was finally behind bars. But for Sonny, the trial meant something different. It meant watching his father led away in handcuffs. It meant reading newspaper accounts that described his father as a murderer, a racketeer, a corrupter of society. It meant living with the knowledge that everyone knew his father was a criminal. May Capone made a decision. She moved herself and Sonny to Miami, Florida, away from Chicago, away from the violence and the reporters and the endless associations. She purchased a home on Palm Island, a modest estate in Biscayne Bay, where she hoped her son might grow up with some semblance of normalcy. The house was comfortable but not ostentatious. May had money. Al had made sure of that, but she did not flaunt it. She wanted to fade into the background, to become just another widow raising her son in South Florida. Sonny enrolled in high school in Miami. He was quiet, studious, careful. Other students knew who he was. How could they not? But he kept his head down, did his work, and told himself that he was not his father. He was not a gangster. He was just a boy trying to earn a diploma. His partial deafness complicated his education. He had to sit at the front of classrooms. He had to ask teachers to repeat themselves. But he persevered, determined to prove that he could succeed through legitimate means. In Miami, the Capone name carried weight, but distance provided some insulation. Florida was not Chicago. The bodies buried in Cook County did not haunt Miami's streets. The St. Valentine's Day massacre had happened 1,000 miles away. Sonny made it through high school without major incident, and in the fall of 1937, he enrolled at the University of Miami. His father, meanwhile, deteriorated on Alcatraz. The syphilis Al Capone had contracted in his youth, left untreated for decades, ravaged his brain. By the late 1930s, he exhibited signs of neurosyphilis, confusion, mood swings, dementia. He wrote incoherent letters to May. He failed to recognize guards he had known for years. Prison doctors documented his decline with clinical detachment, noting each symptom, each loss of function, each step toward complete mental collapse. In November 1939, Al Capone was released early on the grounds of good behavior and diminished mental capacity. He was 40 years old and possessed the cognitive function of a 12-year-old child. The man who once controlled an empire worth millions could no longer control his own mind. He returned to the Palm Island estate, where May and Sonny cared for him. The man who once ruled Chicago with violence and cunning now spent his days in a bathrobe, sometimes speaking to people who were not there, sometimes fishing in the bay for fish that did not exist. Sonny watched his father deteriorate. He was 21 years old, a college student, and he was caring for a man who had once been the most powerful criminal in America. Now that man could not remember what day it was, could not recognize old friends, could not control his emotions or his bladder. It was a humiliation that May bore with dignity and that Sonny endured with resignation. Sonny graduated from the University of Miami in 1941 with a bachelor's degree. He was 23 years old, college-educated, the son of the most notorious gangster in American history, and he wanted nothing to do with crime. His degree represented something his father had never possessed: legitimate credentials, proof of intellectual achievement earned through study rather than violence. He found work as an apprentice printer. The job was honest, skilled, respectable. He learned to set type, operate presses, understand the mechanics of ink and paper. His hands, which could have held guns or counted dirty money, instead arranged letters and fed paper through machines. It was far removed from bootlegging and bribery, from Thompson submachine guns and St. Valentine's Day massacres. It was exactly what he wanted. The work was hard, physical, requiring precision and patience. But it was clean, legal, honorable. In December 1941, the United States entered World War II. Millions of young men enlisted or were drafted. Sonny Capone was not among them. His partial deafness disqualified him from military service. He registered for the draft like every other young man, But the physical examination revealed what he already knew. He could not hear well enough to serve. While his generation fought in Europe and the Pacific, while they stormed beaches and flew bombing missions and died in jungles and deserts, he remained in Miami, working, caring for his ailing father, and trying to build a life separate from his surname. There must have been guilt. His contemporaries were dying at Guadalcanal in Normandy while he set type in Miami. But there was also relief. He had not wanted to fight. He wanted only to be left alone, to work his honest job, to live his quiet life. On January 25, 1947, Al Capone died at the Palm Island estate. He was 48 years old. The cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest following a stroke, but the underlying culprit was neurosyphilis. The disease had destroyed his brain over years of slow, relentless progression. The man who survived gang wars and federal prosecution was killed by a disease he could have cured with penicillin had he sought treatment decades earlier. Sonny was 28 years old when his father died. He inherited the estate, the memories, and the name. 2 out of 3 were burdens. The funeral was small, private. May had insisted. There would be no public spectacle, no mob send-off, no procession of gangsters paying their respects. Al Capone was buried quietly, and the world moved on. He married. He and his wife had 4 daughters. He worked various jobs: tire distributor, businessman, small-scale entrepreneur. He and May opened a restaurant together in Miami, a family business with simple food and modest ambitions. It was called Sonny Capone's. The name was both an asset and a liability. It drew curious customers who wanted to see the son of Scarface, but it also drew unwanted attention from reporters and law enforcement who suspected, wrongly, that the restaurant might be a front for criminal activity. His daughters attended school in Miami, and there the pattern repeated. The cruelty of children is often more direct than the cruelty of adults. Sonny's daughters were mocked, teased, tormented. Their classmates knew who their grandfather was. They made jokes about gangsters and murder. They asked if there were bodies buried in the backyard. They excluded Sonny's daughters from birthday parties and social groups. The sins of the grandfather were visited upon the granddaughters. Sonny made another decision. He moved his family. Again. Still searching for distance, for anonymity, for the simple dignity of being judged on his own merits rather than his father's crimes. But no matter where they went, the name followed. But the name followed him. Everywhere. Job applications, school registrations, introductions. Capone? Like Al Capone? Always the same question. Always the same assumptions. People wanted to know if the rumors were true, if the family still had connections, if there was mob money hidden somewhere, if Sonny himself was involved in crime. The years passed. Sonny worked, provided for his family, stayed out of trouble. He was, by every measurable standard, a law-abiding citizen. He paid his taxes on time, every year, a bitter irony given that tax evasion had destroyed his father. He committed no crimes. He lived the life his father never did. Ordinary, legal, mundane. Then came 1965. In July of that year, in Miami, Florida, Sonny Capone was arrested. The charge was petty theft. He had pocketed a bottle of aspirin and some batteries from a store without paying. The total value was perhaps a few dollars. It was a stupid, impulsive act. Perhaps the act of a man exhausted by decades of scrutiny, or perhaps simply a mistake, a moment of absent-mindedness. The store value was negligible, the legal consequences were minimal, but the newspapers loved it. Son of Al Capone arrested. The headlines wrote themselves. Reporters dredged up his father's history, the murders, the corruption, the empire. They printed Sonny's mugshot alongside old photographs of Al Capone in pinstripe suits and fedoras, creating a visual comparison that implied genetic criminality. The implication was clear. Like father, like son. Never mind that Sonny had lived 47 years without criminal incident. Never mind that the crime was trivial. The name made it news, made it. Sonny Capone was 47 years old. He had lived nearly half a century. He had never been involved in organized crime. He had worked honest jobs, raised his children, cared for his mother and his dying father. And still, he could not escape the shadow. The arrest, as minor as it was, confirmed his worst fear. He would never be free of his father's legacy. He hired a lawyer, and he made a decision that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. On December 7, 1966, Albert Francis Capone legally changed his name to Albert Francis Brown. The hearing was brief. The judge approved the petition without objection. The court records were sealed. After 48 years, Albert Francis Capone ceased to exist, at least on paper. His lawyer spoke to the press afterward. He did this, the lawyer said, because he was just sick and tired of fighting the name. Albert Francis Brown left the courthouse that day with a new identity and the same life. He was still the son of Al Capone, but now, on paper at least, he was someone else. The name change was legal, official, permanent. But it could not change history. It could not erase memory. It could only provide a thin shield of anonymity. The name change offered him something he had never possessed: invisibility. As Albert Brown, he could apply for jobs without triggering immediate recognition. His children could enroll in schools without facing the same relentless questions. He could introduce himself without watching people's faces change, without seeing the calculation in their eyes as they decided whether to treat him as a curiosity or a threat. He moved to California. The distance from Miami was not just geographical, it was psychological. California was as far from Chicago as he could get without leaving the continent. He settled in a quiet neighborhood, kept to himself, maintained his privacy. He did not seek out other former mob families. He did not trade on his name for money or attention. He simply lived. His mother, May Capone, lived until 1986, dying at the age of 89. She had outlived her husband by nearly 4 decades, spending those years in relative obscurity, refusing interviews, declining to write memoirs, protecting what remained of her family's privacy. She never remarried. She never spoke publicly about her life with Al Capone. She took her secrets to the grave. Albert Francis Brown lived quietly for decades. He worked, retired, aged. He became a grandfather. He watched the world change around him: the civil rights movement, Vietnam, Watergate, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the rise of the internet. The world he inhabited in his final years was unrecognizable from the world of his childhood, when his father controlled Chicago and prohibition was the law of the land. He rarely spoke about his father. When asked, he would deflect or decline to comment. There were no tell-all books, no interviews with Barbara Walters or Mike Wallace, no attempts to capitalize on the name he had legally abandoned. He wanted only to be left alone. His neighbors in California knew him as Albert Brown. Some knew he was from Miami. Some knew he had daughters and grandchildren. Few, if any, knew the truth. He was just another elderly man in a neighborhood full of them. He mowed his lawn. He collected his mail. He was invisible, finally. In 2004, at the age of 85, Albert Francis Brown died in California. The cause of death was not widely reported. There was no media frenzy, no retrospective articles examining his life. He died as he had lived for nearly 4 decades, quietly, privately, without fanfare. It was only after his death that some of his neighbors learned the truth. Albert Brown, the polite older man who lived down the street, was the son of Al Capone. Some were shocked, some were fascinated, some didn't believe it at first. But by then, it didn't matter. He was gone. Albert Francis Capone, Sonny, the boy who survived brain surgery and lost his hearing, the young man who earned a college degree and worked honest jobs, the father who moved his family to escape ridicule, the man who legally erased his own name, spent 85 years trying to be someone other than Al Capone's son. In the end, he succeeded. He never joined the mob. He never committed violent crimes. He never built an empire on bloodshed and corruption. He was not his father. But the tragedy of Sonny Capone's life is not that he failed to escape his father's shadow. The tragedy is that he had to try it all. He was born into a world he did not create, saddled with a legacy he did not earn, and spent every day of his life answering for crimes he did not commit. His father's sins became his inheritance, passed down like genetic code, inescapable and permanent. The American criminal justice system convicted Al Capone in 1931, but in a sense, it also convicted his son. Sonny Capone served a life sentence for being born. There is no monument to Albert Francis Capone, no historical marker, no museum exhibit. His grave is unmarked, or marked only with the name Brown. The world remembers his father, the violence, the power, the mythology of the American gangster. But the world forgot the son who chose a different path. And perhaps that is exactly what he wanted, to be forgotten, to be ordinary, to live and die as Albert Brown, a man with no infamous connections, no notorious relatives, no headlines. In his final years, he must have known that his death would bring renewed attention, that reporters would write articles with titles like, "What Happened to Al Capone's Only Son?" That the name he had legally abandoned would be resurrected one final time. But by then, he would be beyond caring, beyond shame, beyond scrutiny, beyond the endless exhausting work of trying to convince the world that he was not a gangster. He was just a man who was born, who lived, who worked, who loved his family, and who died. That should have been enough. For most people it is. But Albert Francis Capone was not most people. He was the son of Scarface, and in America, that meant he would never be free. He died in 2004, the same year Facebook was founded, the same year the Boston Red Sox won the World Series for the first time in 86 years, breaking their own curse. But Sonny Capone's curse was never broken. It ended only when he did. His story is not a story of crime. It is a story of its opposite, the quiet heroism of choosing decency when infamy would have been easier, the determination to live morally when immorality was your inheritance. The name Al Capone evokes images of violence, power, wealth, and corruption. It conjures a specific era of American history, a time when prohibition turned criminals into celebrities and murder into spectacle. But there is another name, Albert Francis Brown, a man you have never heard of, a man who wanted nothing more than to be forgotten. He got his wish. Almost.